Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is proposing a complete exchange of prisoners of war with Russia as a first step towards ending a 3-year conflict. Foreign leaders of countries are gathered in Kyiv today to pledge their support at a high-stakes summit. Mr. Zelenskyy emphasized that Russia must release Ukrainians, offering to exchange all prisoners as a fair starting point to get to that peace. Earlier in the day, EU Commission chief, Ursula von der Leyen, confirmed that Ukraine would receive a new payment of $3.68 billion next month, alongside expanded EU support for arms production and defense capabilities, all seen as a step towards ensuring Kyiv's long-term defense capacities. The European Union also imposing its 16th round of sanctions on Russia. All these target Russia's shadow fleet, financial networks and weapons systems. The EU's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, stressing the need to weaken Russia's war capabilities. The Kremlin responding, saying the latest round of sanctions was, quote, quite predictable. As Western pressure on Moscow grows, the Chinese president has held a call with his Russian counterpart, during which Xi Jinping praised Russia's, quote, positive efforts to defuse the Ukraine crisis. Mr. Xi also backed Moscow's talks with Washington and reaffirmed China's willingness to help broker peace. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, the U.S. is set to introduce a draft resolution calling for a swift end to the conflict, but without specifically addressing Ukraine's territorial integrity. This has raised concerns amongst Kyiv's allies, who have long backed resolutions that must include stronger language against Russia's invasion. A competing resolution led by the European Union will also be put to a vote today. Ahead of that vote, UN Chief Antonio Guterres has called for a just and lasting peace, emphasizing the importance of upholding international law and respecting Ukraine's sovereignty in any resolution to this conflict. And for more, we have Stuart Smith in Kyiv and Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow. Stuart, let's start with you. Our leaders, as we mentioned, from Europe and Canada in Kyiv to show their support. Apart from the symbolic value of this, what more might a summit like this deliver?
Volodymyr Zelenskyy believes it will be an important summit to discuss the strategy of Europe more broadly over, he says, not just the next few months, but the next few weeks, as Europe tries to get itself involved in any peace negotiations that may happen between the United States and Russia. Ukraine and European leaders want a voice in that too. We heard a few statements from a multitude of European leaders, indeed Canada as well, Iceland and Turkey are all represented either in video by video or in person here in Kyiv. One of the most interesting statements, I think, that sums up where largely the vast majority of European leaders think they are at this point came from the Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis, who said they've agreed on two main simple principles. A just peace cannot be confused with an unjust capitulation. And secondly, nor can a temporary ceasefire be confused with a lasting peace. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan was saying that he hopes that next year they can commemorate the anniversary of peace, not of war. But to get there, European leaders are going to need to discuss very difficult questions about how they can not only just be seen to supporting Kyiv diplomatically, but force themselves, in effect, as the Norwegian Prime Minister suggested, into these negotiations by showing what they can actually contribute, whether it be militarily or financially, to Ukraine to make it worth Russia and the United States including them in any negotiations.
Oh, Dasha, we just heard, Stuart, that parallel to Europe preparing itself, also they need to weaken, I suppose, the Kremlin's capabilities, hence the 16th round of sanctions agreed by the European Union. Russia, of course, as we just heard earlier, says it is as it predicted. How else has it responded to this latest round of sanctions?
Well, Moscow has been indeed anticipating this package of sanctions. It was predictable, but also the Kremlin calls these sanctions illegitimate and inefficient. The statement released by the Russian Foreign Ministry suggests that those sanctions are not working. They are working worse and bringing worse consequences for the European Union itself, with Moscow saying that Europe has deprived itself of cheap energy, and that is bad for the economies of the European countries. We also hear in the Kremlin say that the approach of the European Union is actually very different from what is now being seen when it comes to Russia-US relations, that are now seeing an improvement and the desire and the political will to find a negotiated solution. So this is in stark contrast what we are seeing between Russia and the European Union to what we are seeing between Russia and the United States. And certainly Moscow insists that this package of sanctions is not going to help find a negotiated solution to the conflict in Ukraine, with the Russian officials all the time insisting that the sanctions against Russia have only given the stimulus to the development of the Russian economy and to the areas that have been previously underdeveloped. Obviously, the economic indicators do show that Russia is suffering from those sanctions, but still the Russian economy has been showing growth even over the course of those past 3 years.
Dasha, that more recent rapprochement between Moscow and Washington, that might have come as a mild surprise to some, but Russia's ties with China have been warm over the last few years. In fact, Xi Jinping, that's China's president, has just concluded a call with his Russian counterpart. What else came out of that phone call?
Well, that's right. We understand that was a phone conversation that has been expected to take place for a few days already. And in this phone conversation, the Russian president has updated his Chinese counterpart about the negotiations that Moscow held with Washington last week in Saudi Arabia. It is an important part in the bilateral relations because they do stress that they share good and bad times. These two countries, according to the presidents, have shown that the relationships stand the test of time, and they also have pledged to work together for the well-being of the world, for the stability in geopolitics, with also the Kremlin saying that they have discussed the reciprocal visits that the leaders of these two countries will be paying this year to each other countries. So we understand that Xi Jinping will be welcome in the Russian capital for the victory parade on the 9th of May. But obviously this phone conversation comes indeed against the geopolitical context in which Moscow and Washington have started talking, and Moscow felt it necessary to update and to keep the pace with the Chinese counterpart with regards to how those talks are proceeding. And they have agreed in these negotiations that root causes of the conflict in Ukraine have to be addressed. That's the position of the two.
Now, Stuart, Dasha adding there how Russia making an effort to make sure that China is kept informed of better ties that Russia is enjoying with the United States. Those talks in Riyadh last week about Ukraine, but did not actually involve Ukraine. Now you've got President Zelenskyy proposing an all-for-all prisoner swap. Is this being seen as Ukraine trying to reinsert itself, make itself relevant to negotiations for conflict on its own soil?
I think that's exactly right. With Ukraine so far excluded from talks and hoping to try to assert its view of how this peace process should work, Volodymyr Zelenskyy has suggested before the need for prisoner exchanges as part of any deal with Russia, but this is the first time where he's made it clear he sees that as, in effect, the first step. And Ukraine and Russia, one of the few things they've been able to decide on over the course of this conflict, as well as the Black Sea grain deal, has been prisoner exchanges, which have taken place around 60 times since the start of the full-scale invasion, most recently when a few hundred were exchanged at the end of last year. And so for President Zelenskyy, that would be two things. It would help bring back the initiative to Ukraine when it comes to these peace negotiations, and it would also be a test of how serious Russia is, as there is still deep skepticism in Kyiv and frankly in Europe more broadly that Vladimir Putin is serious about trying to end this conflict and not just looking at a way to either stall it or get concessions before then starting up some form of conflict in a few years' time.
Oh, thanks for that. Stuart Smith in Kyiv and Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow helping us keep up to date with very fast-moving events and the different threads of conversation and dialogue that are going.